Hello, everyone. Today is September 17, 2023. I want to wish many of you, or all of you really, Shana Tova, which is a happy Jewish New Year, or Happy New Year to all of you. We have today Hussein Ibish. He will be our guest at the simulation. We are proposing a common government, a federal government for the people of Israel and Palestine, based on a constitution, based on fairness for everyone, regardless of religion, a secular common government that will be the only really legitimate government in Israel, Palestine, because the Israeli government is not a legitimate government in the area of Israel, Palestine, because it's not elected by the people of Israel and Palestine. And the Palestinian governments are not elected by the entire people of Israel, Palestine. Therefore, none of them are legitimate government. We are proposing a common, secular, legitimate government for the whole area from include Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, Jerusalem, 14 million people. Actually, it's now more than 14, based on a democracy, based on a constitution for everyone. We have a website where you can read our constitution. It's at ipconfederation.org. You can go to the constitution part and read the constitution in 3 languages. And you can also read the frequently asked questions. The Constitution explains how the common government will be created and how it will function in conjunction with the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. We are not proposing the dismantling of either the Israeli or the Palestinian government, but we are proposing the creation of a common third government for all of the people there that will function simultaneously and parallel with the Israeli and the Palestinian government. My name is Joseph Avasar. My Gmail is josephavassar@gmail.com, and you can send me your comments after the simulation. Today's guest is Hussein Ibish. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He writes a weekly column for The National, a publication in the UAE, and he used to write for Bloomberg. He also regularly contributes to the New York Times and the Daily Beast, as well as many other publications in the US and the Middle East. He has appeared on thousands of radio and television shows and used to be the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Star, a publication in Beirut where he was born. His most recent book is titled, What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. I met with Hussein before the simulation. He chose 3 legislation to deal with, and they're all excellent, and we will be speaking about them in today's simulation. Hussein just told me that he had a shoulder injury, and that's why he is sitting on the sofa. So I don't want you to think that he's disrespectful of our event, but he is he needs to have a shoulder rested.
Shoulder support. I broke both my shoulders simultaneously a year ago, and I'm still in the beginning stages of a long recovery. So when I get shoulder support, it's much easier for me. So with your indulgence, I'm not hanging around, sleeping. That's not what it is. This isn't even my apartment, but
yeah, I appreciate, we appreciate you making the effort to Hussein. All right, on October 1st, we will have Alon Burstein. He is a visiting assistant professor at the and Israel Institute Fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. And then on October 15, we will have Dr. Einat Wilf. She is a former Israeli politician. She was in the Israeli Knesset, and for the Independents and the Labor Party. We will also have on November 12th, Anna Kalinowska. Anna Kalinowska lives in Estonia, and as you remember, we were discussing many times that Estonia conducts elections online, and she will be speaking to us about the elections online in Estonia. We will also have on the same date Susan Molnar, who is working with the Palestinian refugees in Beirut and other countries, and she's with the organization called Beirut and Beyond. And we will have Mitchell Plitnick on November 26th. He is the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy, and he is also the author of a book that I forgot the name of the book, but is with Mark Lamont Hill, and we will discuss that when he comes in. On November 1st, we will be having unveiling a giant billboard in central Tel Aviv, which says that a Jewish state is bad for the Jews. And I just recorded a video explaining why a Jewish state is bad for the Jews. So that you understand, we are not calling for the dismantling of the Jewish state. We are calling for the creation of another government with the Palestinian and Israelis together to make peace. We had many previous participants, including Noam Chomsky, who appeared twice and recorded a video in support of our formula for peace. Unfortunately, we had some people that we were not able to get. Either they refused or ignore our request, and these are the names. Hopefully we'll try to. I just had a conversation with Zahava Galon. She was very nice, but she declined to come in. She's with the Israeli Marriage Party, and she said that she supports two-state. And I personally have issues with that. I don't think that the two states are going to be a reality, and our formula for peace does not contradict any other formula for peace, including two states. The simulation will take 120 minutes. It will have several minutes. After each segment, we will have Mr. Ibish give his opinion. I think he wrote me an email and he said that he wants to speak at the end, which is fine. We'll give him an opportunity during each segments and at the end to give his opinion and give his and answer questions. And then we'll have.
I don't want to role play. I want to comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me play a video that explains what our vision for peace is.
The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has endured for generations, and instead of time healing the wounds, it's only caused the anger to fester and the violence to grow. But what if there was a way to alleviate the tension? Something that may not outright solve every problem, but at least create a forum that encourages a peaceful compromise. Welcome to the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, a common third government between the Israeli and Palestinian citizens, specifically designed to foster peace, tolerance, and economic prosperity between the two nations. Here's how it works. First off, both Israel and Palestine will keep their respective governments. Israel's Knesset and the Palestinian National Authority will remain unchanged. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, IPC, will be a third entity acting as a unifying agent between the two. The IPC will comprise 300 parliament members elected from 300 districts in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Above them will preside a president and vice president, one Israeli and one Palestinian. In order for the IPC to pass a law, it will require a 55% majority from its Israeli representatives, as well as a 55% majority from its Palestinian representatives, thereby preventing either side from monopolizing the legislature. Of course, the IPC won't undermine the political power of either the Israeli or the Palestinian government. At any time, Israel or Palestine may veto a law passed by the IPC. If neither side vetoes, the law is passed. and the two nations are another step closer to resolution. Please help us make this a reality. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. We might speak different languages, but we all mean the same thing.
So we are actually simulating what we just saw in the video. Before we start with the simulation, we would like to take a pre-simulation survey. Please vote on whether at this time, before the simulation, do you support a common government for the people of Israel and Palestine? And please vote on this issue. Yeah, do you support or not? Okay, two more seconds. At this time, can you publish the votes? 14 out of 17 voted yes, which is 82%, and 3 out of 17 voted no, which is 18%. So that you are, stop sharing, so that you are aware, the audience have been here before, and therefore we have such a high yes, and they've been in previous simulations, and they are already our supporters because they've been in the simulations before. We are here to demonstrate how a common government could make peace, and we are not pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinians. We are pro both Israelis and Palestinians. We are not anti-Israeli or anti-Palestinians. We are pro-peace. Mr. Ibish is not a speaker for the IPC. He was invited to stress test the IPC and give us his opinion. We expect to have a rigorous but respectable discussion in which we will respect each other. It's fine to argue, but let's be respectable to each other. We are not claiming exclusivity. We encourage other formulas for peace, and in fact, we invite people to show us their formula for peace. We will ask Mr. Ibish to judge our plan, not based on perfection. You can see we believe perfection amounts to slavery, because if you aim for perfection, you don't achieve good. You don't achieve anything, because it's impossible to achieve perfection. So we will ask Mr. Ibish, could the IPC formula make peace? Is it implementable? Is there a downside to the Israeli or the Palestinian side if it is implemented? And we'll ask him not to judge us based on perfection, but on the alternative. What is the alternative other than what we are proposing? We are demonstrating how a common government could work by demonstrating legislation that could be acceptable or would be acceptable to both sides. There are many, many legislations what we can demonstrate. We are not the government. We are only simulating how the government will work. And the many legislation that we can demonstrate, we cannot do all of them because of the time limit. But what we are showing you is the tip of the iceberg. We are asking you to look at the big picture. Avoid technical arguments, because there is no time for us to resolve technical issues. We're just asking you to look at the big picture. We are asking you also to refrain from comments during the simulation. Please write your comments on the chat or keep them to the end. However, we encourage questions. They are fine and encouraged at any time during the simulation. We are simulating, we are mimicking the operation of an existing proposed system or proposed system. This is not a lecture, this is a simulation. If I show you a picture of an airplane and you say, Joseph, how does this plane fly? That's a question. But if you say, I will never board a plane because it causes pollution or it's unsafe That's a comment. Please keep the comments to the end or put them on the chat. In order to have this simulation going, we need to make assumptions. So these are the assumptions upon which we are working during this simulation. And these are the assumptions. You have to assume during this simulation the following: that we just concluded an online election. In other words, we had an election for the whole area of Israel, the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. And the election lasted 3 months, not 1 day, not 2 days, but 3 months. That 14 million people, the whole population with the exclusion of minors, were permitted to vote, were given the opportunity to vote. You also have to assume that 5 million people voted in the whole area, that 3 million Palestinians voted and 2 million Israelis voted. You will also have to assume during this simulation that the president received 1.5 million votes. You'll have to assume that me, Joseph, I was elected as president. Now, I do not intend ever to run for president or be president. It just makes it easier for me to conduct the simulation. So you'll have to assume that I was elected by 1.5 million votes, and a vice president, lady Palestinian, was elected by 1.3 million votes, and we will rotate in 2 years. You will also have to assume that 300 parliament members were elected in 300 districts, and each parliament member represents 47,000 people. These are the assumptions upon which we are conducting this simulation. Like I said, this is a simulation. It's not a lecture. Does anyone have any questions regarding those assumptions? Mr. Ibish, do you have any questions regarding those assumptions?
No, I don't.
Are you willing to assume that those assumptions in this simulation?
Absolutely.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions regarding those those assumptions? You can just speak out. We believe that these simulations are achievable with the approximately $100 million could make those assumptions a reality, so that you have some sort of a comparison. One full-fledged war, day of war between Israel and Palestine and Gaza cost over $100 million. So with the budget of 1 day of war between Gaza and Israel, we can make these assumptions a reality, in my opinion. Now, so we already assumed the elections. We assumed that there is a president and vice president and 300 members elected. We need to have volunteers to act as Israeli Prime Minister, Palestinian Authority, and the president of Hamas. And I'm asking some of you to be volunteers. Do I have a volunteer to be an Israeli Prime Minister in this simulation? You will have to assume his personality, his political agenda. Is someone willing to be the Israeli Prime Minister in this simulation? Please, I need a volunteer.
Shlomo Orr is raising his hand, Joseph.
Okay. Shlomo Orr. Terrific. Do I have a volunteer to be Hamas leader? Do I have a volunteer to become a Hamas leader in this simulation? Do I have a volunteer for a PA leader? Nasir, are you willing to be?
Sure.
Okay, PA. And do I have a Hamas leader? I need a Hamas leader. Dawn, are you willing to be the Hamas? Oh, Shineria. Okay, Shineria, you'll be Hamas leader.
Yep, thank you.
Can you hear me? Terrific. Okay, the rest of you will have to be either Israeli or Palestinian parliament members. You'll have to choose your district, and you'll have to remain intellectually honest throughout the simulation. And you'll have to decide whether you're Israeli or Palestinian parliament members. And I may ask you, what district do you represent in either Israel or in Palestine? So I'm asking you to be Palestinian and Israeli parliament members. Let's start with Palestinian parliament members. Please identify yourself. How many Palestinian parliament members do we have? Okay, give him one more second, 2 seconds. Okay, please publish the votes. We have 7 Palestinian parliament members. And let's go to Israeli parliament members. How many Israeli parliament members do we have? Okay. Please publish the vote. 5 Israeli parliament members. All right, so now we have a government, we have parliament, and we have a constitution. The next thing we have to do is a constitution, which we will have to ratify. Libby, could you please read the constitution?
We believe that Palestinians and Israelis are entitled to equal rights under the law and guaranteed human rights and freedom. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation does not intend to supersede or supplant the Palestinian or Israeli governments, nor to abrogate or undermine any agreements between those governments. We recognize the need to work with the Israeli and Palestinian governments. Our purpose is to resolve conflicts and to expand the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis in a fair and equitable manner. We believe in equal rights under the law, guaranteed human rights, and freedom for all. We voluntarily give the legislatures and the governments of Israel and Palestine veto power over legislation we pass relating to the domain of control of those governments. We believe in the separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We believe in the creation of a permanent secular government for all the people residing in Israel and Palestine. We believe in having a separate judicial branch relating to IPC legislation with Israeli and Palestinian judges, with a system to avoid biased decisions based on nationality.
Okay, so this is a short version of the long constitution that is on our website. It basically says that the Israeli and the Palestinian governments, the separate governments, could agree to whatever they want. We do not intend to supersede or supplant those governments. They can agree to a 2-state, they can agree to 1 state, or whatever they agree upon. We are constitutionally bound to accept their agreements. If we pass legislation that violates the Israeli or the Palestinian domain of control, we give them a veto power over that. So the legislation we pass will be subjected to a veto power by the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. Does anyone have any questions regarding this constitution?
I have a small question, and I'm not sure if it's worth wasting time on. But in the situation that we're in here at the moment, I'm very aware, I'm in Jerusalem, I'm very aware that the people don't really seem to have much of a voice. It's either the Supreme Court or the legislature. We don't have referenda. We can go to votes, but we don't have elections coming up. So I'm curious to know, please, Joseph, in your constitution, when you talk about a separate judicial branch relating to IPC legislation with judges being the ones that rule on this, is there going to be a system whereby the people can also be heard at that point? Or is it just when you get to elections?
Well, the people can be heard through their parliament. There are 300 parliament members representing 300 districts. So they will have direct connection to their parliament members, whether it's Israeli or Palestinian. But if you're asking about a referendum, that does not appear in the Constitution. It would be up to the parliament. So you can speak to your parliament member and suggest that they will have a referendum, but the referendum will have to be for the whole area of Israel and Palestine.
Thank you, Joseph. That answers very well.
Any
Thanks.
other questions? Mr. Ibish, do you have any questions or comments regarding the Constitution?
No, I don't, not at this stage.
Okay. So hearing no other questions, let's now, before we ratify the Constitution, the ratification is done by the Parliament. You Parliament members have ran on the idea that you are going to be part of the Parliament, and you already were aware of the Constitution. Just like any other constitution all over the world, the Parliament or the Congress, whoever is in the legislative branch, must accept the Constitution. So I'm going to put this for ratification. However, if you decide not to support the Constitution, you will be expelled from the Parliament and you will not be able to vote on legislation. You will still be a citizen of Israel and Palestine. You can vote, but you will not be a Parliament member because you will be expelled. Let's have the Palestinian Parliament members please vote. Do you support the Constitution? Okay. Please publish their votes. We're missing one Palestinian Parliament member. Stop sharing. Let's have the Israeli Parliament members please vote. Okay. Publish the vote. All right, so all the Palestinian and all the Israeli Parliament members, one Palestinian member did not vote. We're just going to give him the benefit of the doubt that, for this Constitution. So now we have a Constitution, we have a Parliament, we have a president. This is an important event in the history of the Middle East. We never had in the entire history of the Middle East a Parliament, a real democracy with a Constitution, and it is a momentous event that is going to reverberate all over the world when the world is aware that Palestinians and Israelis have agreed to a constitution together, and it's going to put pressure, political pressure, on the Israeli and the Palestinian governments and the governments all over the world, because we have proven that we are able to vote, that we are willing to vote, we're willing to have a government with a constitution, with a parliament. So this is a huge event in the history of humanity, because we've never been done in the history of the world before. All right, let's go to the next step, and that's the, I was expecting to have some objections from Mr. Ibish and prepared responses, but since we have no objections,
well, I don't see anything to object to yet. I mean, I'd rather talk about the specific legislation.
Okay, well, rather than, I mean, the concept of a common government is more important than the legislation. I mean,
I don't object to that at this stage. I mean, the book that I wrote was a long time ago, and I think, you know, it's events have overtaken it. So my view now is that the only way to realize two states in practice, or the only way, but the most likely way, is through some sort of federal or confederated structure. And I think that's unfortunate because it makes it more difficult. but a clean break along Westphalian lines or a la the former Yugoslavia strikes me now as harder to accomplish probably than a some sort of a confederation. So I am more interested now in the sort of thing that you're brainstorming than I would have been before the first Obama term, where I think everything went crashing down and where serious negotiations became effectively impossible. So yeah, I don't particularly object to this.
Okay, we are playing this in front of you to
Yeah,
hear your opinion. You say you
right.
do not object to it.
No.
My question is, do you support this?
Yeah, I would. If I thought that it was implementable, I would.
What's
And
not implementable about it?
I think the biggest flaw comes in when it comes to the legislation. I mean, to me, I'll tell you where I think the biggest flaw is. The biggest flaw is that the confederal structure doesn't resolve the question of property rights, Palestinian property claims. One of the things that has been
Okay, but you said it's not implementable.
yes,
Okay, you have seen that in the simulation, it is implementable. I am
of
asking
course.
you, what is flawed about the simulation? Why?
No, nothing,
Why is
nothing.
this? Why is this
Nothing.
simulation?
Just only this. The only thing it's not a flaw of the simulation, but the difference between the simulation and reality is that this is a self-selecting group. And so that the actual constituencies that would be agreeing or disagreeing to such a welcome development would be very different than this group. So I mean,
I don't understand you. Are you saying that 300 parliament members is unlikely to be elected? Are you saying
no,
the
I'm
election?
saying that if you elected them from the actual constituencies that currently exist among Israelis and Palestinians, you would get a very different outcome than the one that we are getting today from our simulated representatives.
Well, you don't know what the outcome is. We haven't,
I-
all we have
okay.
is parliament members. You don't really know how they think.
Okay, fine, which brings me back to my preference, which is to comment more later on.
Okay. All right.
That's why I wanted to wait. I mean, I
Okay.
agree.
I know, but we are playing we are playing the simulation. I mean, the core of the parliament member is the creation of a common government.
So
and
I don't
we-
have a problem with any of this at all.
Okay. All right.
Joseph, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Hussein, from what you're saying, are you trying to say like that this group of people don't necessarily represent the group of people, like the reality on the ground now? Is that what you're trying to say?
When I was pushed to answer, that was what I came up with, but I didn't forward it as an objection, and I really would rather shelve it and go on with the simulation as a worthy and important exercise, and you know, come to more practical considerations as the conversation goes on.
All right. Our first order of business after we pass the legislation is deciding who and how to give a veto power. So this is our first order of business for the parliament, and we're passing the first legislation. Libby, could you please read this legislation?
The Confederation is the government of the entire population of Israel and Palestine from the river to the sea. We recognize the Palestinian and Israeli governments and are seeking their cooperation to implement our vision for peace by giving them a veto. We will do our utmost to satisfy the essential needs of each government. We are pleading with the Palestinian and Israeli public to understand that while we would like to pass the best legislation possible to improve their lives, under these constraints, a perfect legislation is not possible. We hereby bestow a veto power relating to legislation affecting sovereignty to the following: the government of Israel on issues in which it is indispensable, the Palestinian Authority on issues in which it is indispensable, Hamas on issues in which it is indispensable. In the event of changes in governments, this legislation may be amended or repealed. The Parliament will decide on indispensability. Vetoes may be bestowed individually or collectively.
Does anyone have any questions regarding this?
I start to find a lot of questions. First, I guess I should have been clearer. I'm not sure that elevating Hamas to the same level of the PA or the PLO is wise or workable. So I would throw that out there. Then the second thing is, I'm not sure what exactly the distinction between the national governments that we were discussing here, and whether there are two or three, first of all, and whether there are, what their relationship would be to the federal government. In other words, what does the Confederation get to decide about what happens inside Israel or inside the West Bank or in Gaza that the local governments can't do? What is it that you're allowing them to veto? I understand that there would be certain decisions that the federal government can take, but I don't know what the distribution of powers are under this structure. So maybe it's something to be decided, but that has to be clearer to me.
Well, we are the legitimate government of the whole area, Israel, Palestine. We are the only government that is legitimate, that is elected by the whole area.
Wow.
Now, we recognize that there are three entities
Helpless.
at this time. They are the Israeli government, the PA, and Hamas. These are entities that could block us from implementing our legislation. And therefore, we give them a veto power if their cooperation is indispensable. But if their cooperation is not indispensable, we do not give them a veto power, and we are the one who
that raises another problem. Who determines whether cooperation is dispensable or indispensable?
We do.
I would always say my cooperation is indispensable in all matters.
I know, but we are the common government. Let's say we want to build a airport between Israel and Gaza.
Yeah.
So we decide that without the cooperation of the Israeli or the Palestinian government, we will not be able to do it. Therefore, they are indispensable.
Okay,
But
so the federal government gets to decide when the local governments get to have a veto or not.
Correct.
Okay, that doesn't give them much of a veto. It really means that the veto is contingent on what the federal government wants to allow them to have a veto over. And that then, practically speaking, reduces them to simply agree. I mean, it doesn't really practically give them a veto. Because you can always.
Why not?
Well,
it gives them a veto when they have the power to block us.
But where does their power come from? If the Federation,
it comes from their ability to block us from implementing our legislation.
The problem is that if the Federation is the only legitimate government, then you're having illegitimate governments having the ability to block legitimate governance from doing virtually anything that it would do in the course of governance. You see what I mean?
Correct,
So,
because
okay.
they have the power.
All right,
Even though we do not see them as legitimate,
I understand.
we recognize their power.
I don't think this is going to be practically workable, because I don't think that the empowered local governments, or the three ones that actually have power, will defer to the Confederation over anything they really care about. In other words, that all the power lies in the sources of authority that are being deemed here illegitimate, and they'll simply steamroller the confederated government, if they want to. And that's a problem in terms of actually getting anything done.
Well, remember, we were elected by 5 million people. We
Okay,
had the political
right.
power. We have
Okay.
the political power to demonstrate to the whole world that there is a way to make peace and to save lives and to improve the life of Palestinians and Israelis, unlike the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. And
Okay.
therefore, our legislative political power will have to be taken into consideration.
Okay, so it rests on a moral and political claim, but not a claim of power. Okay.
No,
Thank you
the
for
claim of
clarifying.
power is a political power. We
Yeah.
have 5 million people who voted for us.
Yeah, I understand. Well, okay.
All right, let's
Yes,
go
sir.
to the parliament members, Palestinian parliament members. Do you support this legislation? Palestinian parliament members only. Okay. Please publish the vote. 8 out of 100% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. Let's go let's go to the Israeli parliament members. Do you support this legislation, Israeli parliament members? Okay. And the polling, published the vote. 75% of the Israeli parliament members voted in favor of giving those governments a veto power when necessary. So congratulations. We now know how to proceed on further legislation in which affects the Israeli and the Palestinian parliament. The Israeli and Palestinian separate government. So we just, Mr. Ibish wanted 3 legislation. This is the first legislation that I chose. The order I chose, he gave me the legislation, I chose the order, and which is the IPC demand of the superpower. Charles, are you here? Okay, Libby, could you please read the?
Yes, I could read it if you want.
Yeah, please, Charles.
IPC demand of the superpowers. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation demands that the US, Russia, Great Britain, Germany, China, and Iran, as well as all other countries supplying military arms to our region, alter their policies toward Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East as follows. Immediate 50% reduction of weapons sales and supplies to this region, with all sales or transfers of armaments to end no later than 5 years from now. Immediately implement peaceful relations with all countries in our region. Use economic power to encourage peaceful relations among all countries in this region. Compel consistent standards that they apply to themselves, including but not limited to civil society, peaceful existence, and democratic principles to the countries of the Middle East. This declaration is not submitted to the Israeli and Palestinian government for a veto. However, we encourage all governments in the Middle East to adopt the same.
Does anyone have any questions regarding this demand to the superpower? Mr. Ibish? Do you have any comments or questions?
Mr. Hussein, you're muted. You have to unmute.
No, I noticed I unmuted and muted and I would merely point out that demand is a very strong word when it comes to superpowers. And request might be wiser. You might get more of a sympathetic listening if you called it a request rather than a demand.
Okay, well, the thing is that we are dealing with our lives.
I
And
understand.
we are dealing with the violence that is inflicted on our people.
I'm not
and-
trying to downplay the importance of this.
Yeah,
I am simply saying that people with power don't like, there's a famous saying attributed to Queen Elizabeth I, should is not a word to use with, or must is not a word to use with princes.
Yeah.
They just don't like to be spoken to like that. And I think that goes for national entities as well as narcissistic power holders. So I'm merely pointing out that the word demand is a very, it may not be the most politically or diplomatically wise way of putting it, but I'm just throwing that out there. That's
but we are speaking about governments that
Fine.
pour weapons into
I
our area and risk our lives and causes our loved ones to die and
Listen,
be
I
injured.
completely
Okay.
understand. Truly, from a moral and intellectual perspective, I totally get it.
All right, Mona, did you want to to ask a question?
Yes, sir. One comment, which is to support the suggestion, because it's meant to be strategically advantageous. I believe Mr. Ibish's intent in terms of furthering the likelihood of your appeal being acted upon and heard. So urges or requests, or I think that's in that spirit. It conveys the same urgency and the same value of life, but it maybe have a more effective way of getting the result that you want. The question I have, thank you. The question that I have is, have you considered making the demand in respect of offensive weapons? Because of the inherent right of self-defense, again, strategically, you may get further with a proposal of a demand or a request or an appeal that is limited to offensive weapons, so that the right of inherent self-defense is not in any way used as a pretext to block your demand.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, other people raise their hands. I don't see, I'm sorry, I because of the PowerPoint is so big on my, can you please speak up?
You have Shlomo, and then you have Angela Godfrey Goldstein in that order.
Okay, questions, please.
Just
we have a lot of
quickly,
business to pass.
Just quickly, I agree with Hussein Ibish. Is exactly, we need to change the way we talk about things, and request is good enough. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, please?
Yeah, mine is a very quick one. It seems to me that, as somebody who wants demilitarization and nonviolence and all of that, it's very clear to me the need to get the weapons out of here. On the other hand, I understand that the military industrial complex translates as jobs back in home states. So is it feasible to think through some way of incentivizing those purveyors of weaponry that the factories in every single state in the United States will be busy doing something else?
Is that a comment or a question?
It's a question. Do you have some way that you can think through that people back home in I don't know, upper Vermont or somewhere in the arms industry will not be out of work, and therefore your members of Congress won't be saying, no, it's a lovely idea, but it's really naive, we can't do that, because we would be faced with lots of unemployed?
That's a very good question. I don't want to answer it on the spot because it requires a lot more thinking than I am able to do right on the spot. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. It seems odd that you're not allowing the veto right to any of the governments when the only thing of real substance here, it seems like a very general legislation, except for the 50% of military armaments. And it just seems to implement something like this, you would need the cooperation of those entities too. And
Okay,
it gets back to the question of when you allow a veto or not, it seems
Yeah,
kind of arbitrary.
Exactly. That this is we are not allowing allowing a veto because this is a declaration. This is not a legislation. We are not implementing anything. We're just making ourselves known and our intentions known, and that we are basically sick and tired of all these weapons being sent to our region. But we don't have any way to implement that, and that's why we do not give veto power.
Okay, I personally support that, but I don't see that as being feasible.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Joseph, there's John Yona has his hand up.
Yeah, hi, John.
Hi. So one problem I have with this is Iran being labeled as a superpower. I think it's a regional power at best. And second thing I can make a comment on is I don't know if you have any policy to engage the regional powers like, you know, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey. So I think that's as important, if not more important than engaging with the
It could be regarding all nations, really. All right, let's take a vote. Palestinian parliament members, please vote. Palestinian parliament. Dan, can you put the vote? Dan? Palestinian parliament members, do you agree with this declaration? Okay, publish the vote. Share the results. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members. Let's go to the Israeli parliament members. Please vote. Israeli parliament members. Okay. Publish the vote. 67% voted in favor. So this declaration has passed. It doesn't really have a power of legislation. It just putting the light on the issue of weapons in our region. Let's go to the first legislation that the both sides have a veto power, and that's compensation to Palestinian refugees. Libby, could you please read this?
Original refugees are offered two options. Option 1, return and $250,000 compensation. Option 2, accepting compensation of $500,000 and waiving a right of return. We hereby submit this legislation to the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, and Hamas. We bestow upon them a veto power, which may be exercised in the next 60 days.
Okay, this is legislation that Mr. Ibish requested or suggested. Does anyone have any questions regarding this legislation, including you, Mr. Ibish?
I have quite a few, but let me just start by pointing out that it says original refugees. Do you mean those living who were personally physically displaced in 1947 and 48, and those who were displaced in 1967, or, and perhaps a few others, or do you include their descendants as registered with UNRWA?
This legislation does not apply to descendants. This legislation only applies to refugees that were physically expelled. Yes.
personal refugees, okay.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with this is that, first of all, the sums are very arbitrary. I mean, it's like 250,000, 500,000, and they're nice numbers, but do they, you know, on what, people are going to ask, on what basis did you come up with this? How did you calculate that? And why is every refugee offered the same amount when some people lost a lot more property than others? Some people had nothing. Some people maybe had tremendous lots. And are you sort of compensating them for their experience of having been exiled and not allowed to return? Or is it a compensation based on loss of property? And that brings me to my second point, which I think I'll bring up in a second. Let's deal with this first set of questions, and then I'll follow up.
Okay, the loss of property, we cannot pass legislation on because it is within the jurisdiction, within the sovereignty of the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. We want to have legislation that would recognize the tragedy that happened to the Palestinians, and we are the only government that is offering any compensation to the Palestinian refugees.
May I ask a question? Where does the Federation get its money from?
Okay, that's another legislation that we have, and that is to get our budget will be $20 billion a year for 5 years, and we are getting it from governments all over the world, from international organizations all over the world, the government of Israel, the Palestinian government, and the Hamas government, and organizations from all over the world. Our budget, we anticipate our budget to be $20 billion a year, and the World Bank.
And have you done the math? Would that be sufficient? Well, I guess it would be sufficient for this compensation. But here's where I'm sort of going.
Look, you're arguing technical issues. The question
I'm dropping it. I want to go into something else, which is, to me, it seems like a problem to say we're going to deal with the refugee issue through compensation, but we're not going to talk about property rights, because the fact remains that the biggest obstacle, in my view, to a not just a one-state solution, but even a properly functioning federation or confederation, is the ongoing property right claims that Palestinian refugees, if you recognize their status as refugees, have on so much of the real estate inside the state of Israel at the moment. It's a huge percentage of the privately owned land in 1948. And under such circumstances, then, you have to either find a way of resolving those claims in an affirmative way. So yes, we will not push those claims any further, the way we won't push the claim of return or something like that, or because it's even more obvious that those claims are private and belong to each family or each individual, or find a way to compensate based on individual calculations. I don't think I've ever heard anybody seriously deal with the question of Palestinian property alienated from the families of Palestinians, especially in the 47-48 conflict.
Precisely. I agree with you.
Okay.
And you are judging us based on perfection.
No,
okay?
I'm not.
You're bringing property rights, knowing that we cannot have any jurisdiction, that Israel will never agree to property rights. We are a
Okay.
common government. We are a separate government from the Israeli and the Palestinian government. We're trying to find some compensation to the Palestinians. And you're saying, well, I am against this because it's
No,
not.
I didn't say I was against anything. But wait. I didn't say I was against it.
Oh, okay,
I'm
so you're
saying-
pointing out that it's imperfect.
Yes.
I
Not that it's
agree, it is
imperfect.
imperfect.
No, not that either. That it will hit an obstacle when these claims are made and not resolved. And that the point of any structure like this is that it has to, it really, in order to be effective, it ought to be able to somehow provide a mechanism for resolving the key claims. And
Resolving the what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
key claims.
What is that?
And the key claims, the core
Oh, the key claims, okay.
Yes. And in this case, it seems to me, this is a very central set of grievances and claims that will persist despite the creation of this confederation.
Mr. Ibish, are you aware that the Germans have paid compensation to the Jews
Certainly.
for the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were killed? Couldn't you
More
make
than
the
that.
exact? Couldn't you
No,
make
no,
the
more
exact
than-
same argument against compensating the Jews?
No, I'm not making an argument against compensating anybody. And what I'm noting is that under Stuart Eisenstadt, the US led an international effort to get Germany and some other governments in Europe to compensate individual Jewish families for property that was alienated from them during the Nazi era, during the Holocaust and the repression of Jews in Europe that preceded that. And these have generally held that those property rights were not alienatable due to the passage of time, and they weren't superseded by subsequent political developments like the creation of Germany and its.
You're making a good point here. Okay, let's take a vote.
I'm throwing it out there as
I know,
something
but generally you are throwing the whole issue of the Palestinian refugees on the one government that wants to resolve it. The Israeli government has not resolved it. The Palestinian government has not resolved it. None of them ever attempted. Now we come as a new government after 75 years, and we come in good faith to try to compensate the Palestinian for, we understand it's not full compensation. We're trying to find some ways to compensate them.
I get that.
And it's not fair to us to throw the whole, we are not even responsible for this.
I'm not throwing any way, you just let me be clear. I'm not saying that this is a bad idea because it doesn't deal with it. I'm saying that here is a real problem that if you tried to implement this, practically speaking, would keep coming up time and time again and bedevil the Confederation, as well as relations between the 2 or 3 states or however many states there are within the Confederation. That's what I'm saying, and I'm not wrong about that.
Okay. Let's have the Palestinian parliament.
We have more questions here.
Okay.
So first, I don't understand why we need to put numbers there when we have the example of the Germany paying reparations to Jews. Number 2, if you go with the generation that was expelled, the 800,000 people were expelled in 1948, who is left, who is still alive? So you will have to deal with families and all of that. This is a very complex problem, and I'm all for it, but doing it...
Look, I agree, this is not a perfect solution, okay? We are a new government with we are government of Palestinians and Israelis together, okay? you are asking us as a common government, new government after 75 years to solve what the Israeli and the Palestinian governments have not been based on perfection. I'm sorry, we're not able to do that. We would love to be perfect, but we cannot. All right, this is the Palestinian parliament members.
Joseph, I have a question too.
Yes.
That the other thing is that why should this compensation, you're saying that we're not a perfect government. We're saying that it's not the perfect solution, but the thing is you're putting a provision here, waiving the right of return, giving up that right. That's a permanent, how should I say, that's a permanent status that someone is going to accept. I mean, I personally find this racist because number one, we're not asking Jews to not have the right to come and become Israeli citizens. You're basically going to like places like refugee camps where people are living in very poor conditions and offering them money to give up their right. This is sort of.
I agree. And the reason I do that is because I want to get the Israeli parliament members to support this.
But I understand. But what you're doing here is you're basically using the economic situation of these people, and you're basically kind of like having them give up their right. It's racist because you're applying this to Palestinians. I want Jews to not have the right to return. So
look, you can make that argument, and it's a totally acceptable, agreed argument. Okay, we do not have the power to have them return or not return. It's not within our jurisdiction.
Yeah, but you're offering them compensation to waive the right of return. That's so inhumane. That's the most immoral thing I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, okay. The reason we're offering them compensation is because we want the Israeli parliament members to accept that formula.
Okay, but offering them compensation should not be linked to waiving their right of return. That's unacceptable.
You will not have, okay, if we remove that, in my judgment, the Israeli parliament members will not agree to it, and you will have no compensation whatsoever. Okay, and what will you be left with? The Israeli and the Palestinian governments who failed you for 75 years. Okay, 75% of the Palestinian.
That's irrelevant.
Look, I'm not here to argue with you. This is like just say 75%.
Okay, vote on it then. Don't argue.
Okay, let's go to the Israeli parliament members. Please vote.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. 70.
Some of us still have questions and comments.
Okay, let's have the Israeli parliament. You can ask your questions while the voting is going on. Israeli parliament members. Okay.
I am a
Publish
Palestinian
the vote. Publish the vote. Okay, this legislation, 33% of the Israeli parliament members voted yes, 67 voted against. Okay, so this legislation fails, and we'll go to the amended one. Let's go to the
comment by Jasmine.
Oh, hi.
I'm just curious if it's possible during the simulation to make amendments to what's written here based on the discussion. So for example, the waiving of the right of return, like could that be, it seems like that was a big point of contention, especially on the Palestinian side. So if we were to propose removing that piece before moving forward with it, if that would happen, or like going back to the earlier one too about the word request versus demand for the superpowers. Because it just seems like there's some really great discussion happening here, and I'm just curious if we can.
Yeah, obviously, yes. That's
some
a
amendments.
good question. I mean, for this, we have an amended compensation to Palestinian refugees. This is the amended one. For the previous one, we didn't have, but yes, look, the purpose is to demonstrate that the common government could create another system to work with the Israeli and the Palestinian government. It's not set in stone. So in preparation for legislation, the president will go and talk to the Israeli and the Palestinian parliament members and their government and find out what's acceptable. So it will change. It will be amended, just like any other legislation. So it's hard to do it, you know, in a demonstration of within an hour or an hour and a half. So, but in real life, that's how it's done. It's amendments are done all the time, and pre-negotiations are done all the time. So on this,
You know,
one,
Joseph, this is Jeff Warner. I'd really be I support this last speaker. I mean, I would really like to know hear why people voted against this.
that's a good question. Can we identify some of the Israeli parliament members who voted against this?
But before that, Joseph, I've been waiting to make a suggestion on this issue. And I
This is
think
Mona.
there's General Prince, somebody called General Prince. There's maybe 2 of us or 3 of us possibly that have been waiting.
Mona, go ahead.
No, never mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, go
Never
ahead.
mind. Go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, so I mean, we have had this discussion on previous occasions on this resolution, including in the session where I had the honor to be the guest speaker. And my understanding was that some progress was made on this issue, some distinctions were made on this issue, and that would be reflected in the later iterations of this legislation. One area, for instance, and this sounds like a comment, but it's more of a suggestion in the sense that for your consideration in the future, if you distinguish between, and it may alleviate some of the concerns that the Palestinians and Israeli participants are having. One is, it's not waiving the right of return, because that's an inalienable right that resides in every refugee, Palestinian and otherwise. It's waiving the exercise of that right. The person would have the choice to refrain from exercising their right, even though they possess the right, that they would not exercise the right. And in lieu of that waiver, they would be compensated. This is 100% consistent for Nasir's benefit. Consistent with international law, international refugee law, that where there's a violation, corrective remedy can consist of return and or compensation. So there would be a legal solution, but we're talking about the exercise of the right, not the right itself.
Okay, good point. I wrote it down.
Okay, so if you can reflect that in the future iterations, I think you would go a
That's
long
a very good point.
way in building consensus.
Can I just say that I really appreciate what Mona just said, because I abstained from voting, even though I saw that people could return if they wanted to. I just feel very uncomfortable with going over international law in that way, or what it seemed to be, without, for example, going to the United Nations and getting their, Security Council resolution to facilitate this. I hope that's clear now.
Okay, Jeff asked a good question. Could the Israeli parliament members, or for that matter, I think the Palestinian parliament members who voted against this legislation, let's start with the Israeli. Could you please identify yourself and what district you represent? Israeli parliament members that voted against this legislation.
Okay, this is Don. Was representing the district of Jaffa, and I simply voted against it because, as all of these questions indicated, it was too vague, and I think a lot more thought and consideration needs to go into such a legislation. I think it opens up too many questions, as stated.
What's vague about it?
Well, I don't know. To me, it seems it's cosmetic in a sense. I don't think it's. I'm not sure what it's accomplishing in the bigger picture, and it seems to be a quick, sweep at a much larger question. And I don't feel that I could vote for it at this time.
Okay, I'm not clear about your answer. Is there any other Israeli parliament members who want to identify himself and tell us what district he or she represents? Okay, I don't hear any. Look, when the real votes take place, you will have to identify yourself. It's going to be an open vote.
Hey, Joseph.
Yeah.
Could I recommend a future, like a real quick amendment, like for the future vote for this, that would make it less controversial?
Sure.
Okay, for example, instead of saying waiving a right of return, I would say that the 500,000 be included waiving the right of return to the lands that would be considered Israel, but not to a future Palestine state. And I think that that's a compromise that Palestinians have made, including Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president, who, by the way, I'm basically the person who's from Safad, for example. He has acknowledged, I was born in Safad. That's where I was born. That's where my family's from, but I'm accepting returning to the West Bank. That to me sounds like a compromise, because we say we're not looking for a perfect solution, but the waiving of right of return is just something that's disturbing to me, because it tells people in Lebanon,
Yeah.
here's some money.
That's a very good
Goodbye.
point. That's a very good point.
So
Okay.
I, as a Palestinian president from the 48 territories, this is something that I'm putting front, and this is something perfectly reasonable.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, let's go to the amended one.
I have another suggestion, that the difference in the money with waiving the should be more than just a factor of 2. I think it would be a more interesting thing if it was a factor of 4 or 10 or something like that.
Yeah, but you have to understand our limited budget. I mean, if we are talking about several 100,000 people or 200,000, and you're speaking about $1 million for each, that's way above our budget. Have to be some reason.
You could reduce the amount, because I think for most Palestinians, it's more about having their rights acknowledged.
I see. Okay. All right. Excellent. All right. Let's go to the amended compensation to Palestinian refugees. This is the amended one, since the first one failed, and it failed before, so that's why we created the amended one. Let me read it to you before you put it for vote. Original 1948 and 1967 refugees to be compensated $100,000 each. First generation descendants of original refugees to be compensated $25,000 each. This legislation is not submitted to the Israeli or Palestinian government for veto, since it does not violate their sovereignty. We are just the common government. We want to compensate the Palestinian refugees. Let's have the Palestinian parliament members vote on this.
I think this is much better in every way.
Palestinian parliament members, please vote. Don, can you put the vote? Dan? Okay, publish the vote. Can you publish the vote? 86% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor. Let's have the Israeli parliament members please vote. This is money coming out of our own budget. Okay, publish the vote. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted. So basically, what we accomplished here is we are acknowledging the refugees. We're acknowledging the tragedy that happened to the refugees. And we are hoping that by acknowledging the refugees and compensating them, that would create some sort of a peaceful message to both the Israelis and the Palestinians that we are a serious government and we want to do what's right for the people of Israel and Palestine. Let's go to the next legislation, and that is removal of the wall. This is another legislation that Mr. Ibish suggested. Libby, could you please read it?
The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation is calling for the Israeli government to promptly remove the wall, fences, barriers, and all checkpoints scattered across the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. We hereby submit this legislation to the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, and Hamas, bestowing upon them a veto power which may be exercised in the next 60 days.
So this legislation was suggested by Nasir, I believe. And
No, I see. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
and let's have Mr. Ibish, can you
Yeah, let me tell you why I picked it. Because to me, well, obviously, such a development is absolutely necessary if you're going to have a well-functioning confederation so that people can move within the different entities that are confederated freely, and goods and services and labor and all of that, which is, really without which you don't have much of a confederation. It raises a more important issue in a way, or forces a more important issue, which is, what is the Palestinian entity at work here, or the two Palestinian entities? Where are they? Where do they have sovereignty, if anywhere? Does Israel remain, in effect, the occupying power in, say, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, or does it not? If it's not the occupying power, then it can't have checkpoints and walls and barriers and all of that. If it is, arguably it can certainly have checkpoints, and then there become complex legal arguments about rights of occupying powers. They certainly can't have settlements, but if it's not, then what's the nature of the relationship? Where are these Palestinian entities sovereign, if anywhere? And where is Israel not the de facto sovereign, if anywhere? And so it seems to me this is sort of like almost it's a very good piece of legislation, but it supersedes one that would have to come first, which is one defining what is Israel and where the Israeli government that is referred to, that's a core element here of the Confederation, holds sway and has authority, and where the Palestinian entities do and don't. And
okay,
so,
let me respond to that.
Good.
These governments are failed governments. We are not in the business of defining their jurisdiction because we feel that they failed the people of Israel and Palestine. So we do not want to be thrown into the morass of who is the better government and what government has jurisdiction and legitimacy. We are basically saying none of them are legitimate. They only have physical power. Okay, so we want to reduce their physical power, and we're not there to define their physical power, and we do that by suggesting our own legislation, by demonstrating to the people of Israel and Palestine that we are the legitimate government. We're the only one elected. Okay, let's just, do other people have any questions?
Yes, I do. Please, quick one. If you're talking about removing the wall and the barriers, the problem that I see is that the wall and the barriers have been part of a huge land grab, water grab, Dead Sea minerals grab, et cetera, Is it feasible, Joseph, to put in that legislation there something about returning the stolen resources to their rightful owners, farmers and their land, et cetera?
It is possible. Look, everything is possible to put under legislation. The question is, would it make it more likely to pass or not?
So what's the point then? He wants something to be
we're not
passed,
speaking
and
about.
they say, well, it was agreed.
We're not speaking about perfection. Okay, so we are trying to see what could pass. What is it that the Israeli and the Palestinian parliament,
We'll start with
in good conscience,
ending
could
the
pass?
occupation. That's the first step.
Well, that's what I was trying to say, you see.
Okay, absolutely, and the occupation. The question is, will the Israeli and the Palestinian parliament members agree to that?
No.
That's what,
Neither parliament is,
I mean, ending the occupation means two states. That means we have to decide where the border is, okay? So you cannot come from a Israeli perspective or Palestinian perspective and claim that the only legislation you will support is from an Israeli perspective or Palestinian perspective. You have to see it from what would be acceptable to both sides. That's the challenge here. Not to make unilateral declarations that support your pre-existing opinion. All right, let's have the
Before we vote, can I just make a quick question? So is that the key thing about this legislation is what it does is it's talking about barriers inside the West Bank. So meaning that if many Israelis are going to say, well, it prevents attackers, it does this, even though that's not the reason for it. This wall was built because it wanted to grab land. That's the purpose of this wall. So what we can say is that if Israelis feel like they need security, there's nothing to stop them from building walls around their cities. But the question here is the removal of the walls are because these walls not only don't divide Israel from Palestine, they divide Palestinians from other Palestinian towns. And you can see the city in my background here. This is Beit Hanina. Beit Hanina is split in half because of this wall. And so this is the reason I think that when people vote on this legislation, to understand that this is the wall that's happening, that is a land grab wall. It is a wall that is dividing Palestinians at checkpoints that are not in between Israel and Palestine, but in between Palestine and Palestine. When you go from Nablus to Ramallah, when you go from Jenin from Hebron to Jerusalem, these are the walls that we're talking about, not going
that's absolutely true. I've seen it with my own eyes. All right, let's have a Palestinian parliament members please vote on this legislation. Palestinian parliament members. Okay, publish the vote. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. Let's have the Israeli parliament members. Okay, publish the vote. 4 out of 4. Okay, so it's 100% who voted agree with this legislation. Let's go to the Prime Minister of Israel. Mr. Prime Minister, are you going to veto this legislation?
No, in the name of peace and justice, no. But
okay, Jeff, you raise your hand.
Yeah. NASA just said that there are walls between when you drive between Nablus and Ramallah, and I did that about 4 years ago and there were not only no walls, but there were no checkpoints. So can he please explain what he meant?
There's a checkpoint at Hawarma, which is called the Tapawach Conjunction. It's a roundabout. There's checkpoints there. There's checkpoints at the DSO. There's checkpoints. I mean, there is checkpoints there.
Yeah. Okay. These are technical issues. Let's go.
I was in a bus, a Tamini bus, public bus from Ramallah to Nablus and from Nablus to Ramallah about 3-4 years ago, and there were no checkpoints.
Well, I'm told you, Tapawach Junction near Hawara is a checkpoint.
Okay. I apologize.
We're not here to have a factual discussion between.
Expected to do that.
Okay, let's have the Hamas leader, Mrs. Hamas leader. Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I won't veto it, but
okay. Okay, let's go to the Prime Minister of President of Palestine. You're going to veto this legislation. Palestinian president, are you going to veto this legislation?
Oh, I'm sorry, my bad. No, absolutely not.
Okay, good. Okay, so
I wish Shlomo Or was prime minister. I don't think I don't think the existing prime minister, I have to disagree with Shlomo
yeah,
because
I agree.
I don't think Netanyahu would have supported this, but it's
Yeah,
okay. We like
I
you,
agree.
Shlomo.
I agree.
So,
Okay, after participating in the simulation, do you support a common government for the people of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Gaza that will coexist with the Israeli and the Palestinian government? This is a post-simulation survey. Please vote. That's all of you voting now.
Common government for Israel and Palestine to make, yes. No, say yes. Common one government. I think yes.
Okay. Okay, and the election, the voting, 15 out of 15, 100% voted yes. So before we had 14 out of 17 voted yes. Now we have 15 out of 15 voted. So it went up by one person, which is very good. And now I'm going to open up to a discussion. Going to stop sharing.
Joseph, can you share the slide with I wanted to take a screenshot of that one of the last legislation. Do you mind?
Sure.
The one before, the one that we voted on the wall, the removal of the wall. There we go, right there. 1 second. Give me 1 second. All right, thank you.
All right. Let's go to Mr. Ibish to give us his remarks, and then we'll ask questions of Mr. Ibish.
Well, I think overall, this is a very interesting conversation, and it's an interesting simulation. But I think that there's a lot more work needs to go into this. It's a good place to start because at the moment, there's really nothing to work with in terms of negotiations between the political parties, the government of Israel and the PLO, that would have to be negotiating with each other. There's no framework for it. There's no basis for it. So we have to think differently and we have to think big. So I thoroughly approve of your project, Joseph. And I want to thank everybody who comes and participates in this for thinking outside the box and daring to think big. It's what needs to be done. But as you can tell, I have a number of reservations about the how practically implementable the work that's been done here so far is. I think arguably you're 10 steps ahead of almost anybody else, but that doesn't mean you have arrived at anything that is practically implementable. So, you know, I simply would offer you my congratulations, encouragement, and support, and tell you thank you very much. And I've been really very glad to join you today. Those are really sort of my general thoughts.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Ibish? Okay, Jasmine.
Hussein Ibish, my question for you is there anything that, like, I guess the top 1 or 2 things that you think could really make this idea more practical from your perspective? What would be your ideas for that?
I mean, it's very hard to say because we're so far from it. I suppose what needs to happen is for significant political movements, parties, or entities among Israelis and Palestinians to take this up as a vision and a goal, and could be even just saying what we need is a confederation, what we need is a federal system, and then pushing for that in some way or another. The fact is, at the moment, you really don't have any significant political grouping on the ground either among Israelis or among Palestinians, that takes this position and that is in favor of achieving a two-state reality through a confederated structure or anything like that. What you have is a set of politicians on all sides who still use traditional national narratives and national visions to mobilize their constituents and gain credibility and political leverage and legitimacy. As long as that's the case, it's going to be very hard for these ideas to break through. But if you could start to see the emergence of serious forces on either side, and even better on both sides, that started talking seriously about confederation as a model, then that would be, I think, the biggest step forward. Honestly, before you get that, I think it's very hard to make it more attractive to the public, because they won't think that it's practicable. The question that begs is, how do you do that? I don't really know the answer, but I would simply say there's your breakthrough, obviously.
All right, let's go to General Prince and then Nasir. I think I saw Shlomo there. Shlomo, I'm sorry. Shlomo first, General Nasir, and then Charles.
No, I think he answered my question already. So
okay, let's go to General and then Nasir and then Charles.
Mr. Ibish, if an election was put forth to the people, let's just take a microcosm and let's just say Gaza, okay? If an election was put forth for this common government, how many of those, I don't remember what exactly the number is, let's say 1 million people. Out of the 1 million people, how many people will actually participate in the vote?
I really don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I think there'd be a lot of interest, especially in Gaza, in participating, but I just don't know. And it would make a big difference if it was something that was potentially real versus something that was symbolic. And if it's symbolic, the interest is going to be attenuated. But if it's a real thing that is plausibly going to exist, I think you could see a lot of interest in, among Palestinians to participate in it, because they are desperate for a way forward. They don't have a way forward. They don't even have a viable national strategy anymore, and they desperately need one.
Do you see a mental block for any kind of solution from anybody there?
Oh, sure. I mean, you mean among the Palestinians or among anybody?
Anybody there.
Oh, yeah.
What I'm trying to say is many people have lost hope in any kind of solution. I'm just saying, yeah.
There are all kinds. There's despair. There's cynicism. There's fanaticism, whether it's nationalistic or religious or a combination of the two. There's being satisfied with the status quo because you benefit from it financially, politically, or in some other way. Fear of change, especially on the Israeli side. So there are lots of ideas, moods, and neurotic symptoms that would have to be overcome. No doubt about it.
I just want to go over what Nasir asked, will people vote? I think before the question of will people vote, the question is, will people run? That's what will motivate people to vote, is if there are candidates running, and that can be encouraged. And I think that, yes, we will have people running, and then we will also have people voting, because there will be a competition. In every election, first you need to have people running, and then people will vote based on who they support. Let's go to General.
General spoke. He was the one who said about the vote.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry, the Nasir.
Yeah. And I actually rolled into my question to Mr. Hussein. Mr. Hussein, I want to first of all thank you for coming. And
Pleasure.
despite the fact that you're struggling with your pain and things, I wish you the best.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you real quick. I know you were born in Lebanon. Are you of Palestinian ancestry? Were your parents
No.
from? Oh, okay.
No, no,
I
no.
wasn't sure. Okay.
No, I'm not. I'm a Lebanese citizen of Syrian Kurdish origin.
Ah, okay, awesome. Okay, thank you.
I'm not Palestinian.
Okay. The thing I wanted to ask you is that I'm a Palestinian and I lived predominantly in the United States. I've lived also at home Jerusalem, where my family is from, where we still have a home. And you touched a little bit about the political frustration, about the fanaticism and stuff like that. And I always say that there's a political constipation among the Palestinians because we don't know where we're going. There's no direction. The leadership is not offering direction. And it's more like a drowning man just trying to get the next breath, not thinking about what am I going to do when I get to the land. Right. So my question to you is, because of the Palestinian issue has always been sort of attached to the pan-Arab and Arab nationalist cause. Yeah. And into light of consideration today, Saudi Arabia announced that they're they are halting the negotiations of normalization with Israel because of the right-wing policies of the government. Has it been a liability for Palestinians? That's the first part of the question. Has it been a liability for Palestinians to link their cause to other Arab nationalist movements or the pan-Arab nationalist movement? And secondly, wouldn't it be wiser for the new institutions to be developed that focus on the Palestinians themselves internally, democratic institutions, civil rights movements, and things like that? Because we kind of get thrown in the back burner in the Middle East, you know? And
then it's a great question. So let me take the first one, the second one first. Yes, without a doubt, decoupling is really important because one of the things that happened is that when the PLO, which is the it's the diplomatic representative of the Palestinian people on the world stage, when the PLO ran out of options in terms of the Oslo process and negotiating with Israel after the first Obama term and the settlement freeze fiasco, they basically, whenever one asked a senior Palestinian leader associated with the PLO or even the PA, what's your national liberation strategy? They would mention the Arab Peace Initiative or they would describe the Arab Peace Initiative without using the words Arab Peace Initiative. In other words, linking Israel lifting the occupation with Israeli normalization with the Arab countries and the broader Islamic countries, because the Organization of Islamic Cooperation also adopted the Arab Peace Initiative in toto. The thing is that it was always deeply flawed because a people cannot successfully place their national liberation strategy in the hands of others to define and implement, because those others have different interests. By definition, they are not the same. They are others. So of course they have their own interests. Now, that it all came crashing down with the Abraham Accords when the UAE in particular, but Bahrain also, reinterpreted the Abraham Accords and flipped the chronology so that it wasn't deal with the occupation first and then have normalization with Israel. It became normalized with Israel first, and then maybe, hopefully at some point, deal with the occupation if you can. And basically they adopted an attitude towards Israel very, very much like a lot of European countries, which is you have parallel tracks. You deal with the Israelis on the one side, while on another track, you object to the occupation and you don't deal with the settlements and stuff like that. Okay. What that meant for the Palestinian national movement was it exposed the fact that they didn't have a national strategy. It made it very obvious that they didn't have a national strategy because it was rendered inoperative by somebody else, you know, and because that else controlled it. Now, the reason they don't have a national strategy or haven't been able to come up with an alternative is they don't have a national leadership, right? You've got Abu Mazen, who's happy to be the mayor of Ramallah and a few other cities in the West Bank, and doesn't want to be a national leader. And you can see that by his reticence to take risks, especially when it came to getting involved in Gaza, when it came to getting involved in the Allenby Bridge crossing and things like that. He's just happy with the status quo. He doesn't want to take risks, and therefore he's not a national leader. Hamas is not capable of being a national leader on the world stage for the Palestinians because of their policies and the number of countries and entities that won't deal with them because of their relationship to violence and things like that. So obviously it's a complete tragedy, and I totally agree with what you're saying. The turn inward and to recreate Palestinian civil society, which used to be very vibrant, but now is sort of moribund in the West Bank and is basically dead in Gaza. You have a business community in Gaza, but not really a civil society anymore. You know, this is the biggest tragedy and the biggest weakness, I think. So rebuilding that, you know, structures that give voice to ordinary people, multiple organizations, their ability to function. This then also facilitates holding real elections, right? Not phony, binary, you know, Fatah versus Hamas, cyanide and arsenic choices that people aren't interested in. You can have a real choice if you had a vibrant civil society and campaigning and all of that. So big yes to your second point. I would also say it's not just the pan-Arab idea that has appropriated the Palestinian cause, but also the pan-Islamic idea, the various Islamist movements, even though they are against the specific Arab nationalisms, they have championed the Palestinians, not because they believe in the Palestinian cause, but because it wins brownie points with people. It's a surefire, you know, popularity win. What I wanted to say about the Palestinian relationship with these regional movements is that it's part of a very complex Palestinian history where, you know, at the time of the beginning of the mandate, it's pretty clear Palestinians were not looking to be an independent national movement, right? That wasn't their goal. They really wanted to be part of something bigger for many reasons, chief among them that it would be much easier to resist Zionism as part of something bigger. But I think once the first pan-Arab state under Faisal in Damascus came crashing down in the early 1920s in Syria, it became increasingly clear to Palestinians that they could not rely on anybody else, and they had to fend for themselves against Zionism, against the mandate, against whatever they were confronting. And then the Nakba is a unique experience that only Palestinians have, and that distinguishes the Palestinians from everybody else in the Arab world who did not experience that. And so it means that the Palestinian national identity is really strong. And say, take Hamas cadres and Fatah cadres. The one thing they can agree on is they're all Palestinians. None of them have done any kind of national takfir against each other. They've never said of each other, you know, you're not a Palestinian or anything like that. And so it does even survive that. And in a funny way, maybe national consciousness among Palestinians is so strong because of the shared national tragedies and because they haven't been able to exercise national self-determination. But having pointed all of that out, I want to circle back and say, for all those reasons, hell yes, absolutely. The more you can cut the cord with these broader movements, the better. And focusing inward, particularly on civil society, is the way to go.
All right, let's go to Charles.
Charles, could I just
and then Mona.
Charles, could I just say something real quick before? There was an interesting article there was an interesting article in the 972 magazine with Hanan Ashrawi about the 30-year anniversary of Oslo. And she specifically said something that caught me, was that when she was going to Madrid before the Oslo Accord, how when they would return from Madrid in the talks with Israel, that they would have town hall meetings where people would talk and say, this is what we want and this. And she said that at that time, 90% of Palestinians were behind them. But now the leadership is so separated from the masses, where in like when I go back to Palestine and I try to go back every year, you have like the government of the cities, the municipalities, which are actually sometimes pretty democratic and pretty impressive, but it doesn't translate to the national. It's like stays to the local, to the municipality or what we call the Diwan, where the villages are. So okay, thank you.
That's exactly right.
All right, Charles, and then Mona.
Given from my perspective, I'm not that close because I have never lived in the area. I did visit Syria once, but from my perspective, both Fatah and Hamas are basically denuded, incapable. Israel needs Hamas because they need an enemy. They need Fatah because they need a policeman. And within Israel, you've got, the majority parties who are like at each other's throats. But my question to you is this. So given that that's kind of the political landscape, there are these minuscule political parties that hang in there with some kind of sense of desiring some kind of sense of justice for the Palestinians and looking at that staying within the Knesset. So within that category, and I realize that's 2% if you're lucky, maybe. Do you see that constituency as being the natural conduit for something like the IPC? And do they try and reach out? There are Arab parties too, I know, that are useful and or necessary in forming a coalition with the liberal center, which has kind of disappeared at the moment. Is there any coalescence in there? Do you feel like that could be in terms of an indigenous support for ideas like the IPC could start to grow from that place?
I mean, it certainly could, but to me, it looks like the Israeli polity in general, the Israeli body politic, is moving in the other direction, and it's moving in the direction of annexation. And so it may be that for such an idea to take hold among a critical mass of Jewish Israelis, or even a significant chunk of Jewish Israelis, let's say, something like 10% or more, we may have to, in fact, pass through a period of a convulsion of annexation. And what I fear is that we've been on a very dangerous train track for a long time, since the failure of the Camp David negotiations in the summer of 2000. I believe, and I said so at the time, and I still think it's true, that people being people and behaving the way people behave, the most likely long-term scenario was that the Israelis would try to take by force on the ground what they couldn't get Palestinians to agree to at the negotiating table in 2000, and basically impose new borders, new de facto borders of their own liking. And I think that not only is that day getting closer and closer, where you have this, much more empowered, openly annexationist political movement inside Israel that's now, in major positions of strength in the current Netanyahu cabinet. You also have a lot of Likud, which has become openly annexationist, and others. But you've also got, I think, the scope of annexation has gotten much bigger now, in part thanks to Trump, and in part thanks to just the fact that Israelis being human beings, when human beings really want something, and there's nothing stopping them, practically speaking, from just taking it, other than enlightened self-interest, they almost always will just take it. And so where I think we've been going, and it seems to me, there's nothing really has happened in the past 25 years to make me doubt that this is where we've been headed, is to unilateral annexation of big chunks of the West Bank. And I don't know what I guess Israel would simply walk away from the rest or Gazify the rest of it. And I would think that there would be some significant expulsion of Palestinians in the process. I think, again, so 25 years ago, it would have been possible to argue, well, in the 40s and the 60s, you could do this, but now it's a rules-based order, and Israel really wouldn't try and couldn't try, and they won't do it, and the IDF won't do it, and the world won't accept it. I don't think any of that's true anymore. I don't see what on earth the international community could or would say in that context. I don't think that the IDF in general would say no to it. And especially if it happened in the context of a major explosion of sectarian violence, communal violence, not sectarian violence, communal violence in the West Bank, which is inevitable given the living conditions and relations between the communities there at some point in the foreseeable future. So in my view, the explosion is coming. And when the explosion happens, now you've got an Israeli polity that's ready, willing, and able, I think, to say that's it. We're very sorry to do this. It's a sad necessity, but we have no choice to protect our people and protect our country and everything. We have to impose new borders, and we have to remove some of these people who are, it's just too dangerous, it's too chaotic. We didn't really mean it, but it happened. And now we can't let them back in. Very similar to the past. I think that's where we're going. Now, when that fails, as it will, to resolve the conflict, then maybe we'll be in a position to relook at this. But it's a pessimistic point of view. But the reason it's pessimistic is that it creates a longer term scenario than I think any of us would want. And the reason for that is that I just don't see the Israeli body politic as being anywhere near considering anything remotely like what we're talking about. That's my view.
Assuming that your projection is correct, and that this basic kind of conflagration, which I assume will be sort of settlers taking the initiative and then being backed by the IDF when they're resisted, and the government going, oh, gee, shucks, well, okay.
Hard to say, but yeah.
At that point, do you see this current round of acceptance, both in the Arab world and not total outright resistance, at least certainly on the part of the United States, reversing itself in any way so that they can put any kind of brakes on this?
Yeah, it breaks, no. But it certainly could reverse. It depends on the scope of annexation and the overall context. It depends on the political situation in the Gulf states. It depends on the relative strength of Iran. It depends what has been accomplished between Israel and various Arab countries in security terms. So it's impossible to tell because it's going to depend a great deal on the broader context. It's going to be a decision that is going to be made in strategic terms. But there's one of the things that will happen is a huge public outcry, including within the societies that have normalized. And it's going to be challenging for those governments to not to respond in some kind of a way that downgrades relations with Israel, if not overturns them. It's hard to predict, but the Israelis would do well to understand that there could be a very serious price to be paid in terms of relations with Arab countries.
Let's go to Mona and then to Sean, I believe. Sean, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. I wanted to ask him.
Okay, but Mona is before you.
Okay,
I can wait.
These
It's
are gonna
okay.
have to be the last two questions for me because it's 2
Yeah.
o'clock.
Okay,
Thank you very much, by the way.
You are welcome.
okay.
And I also wish to thank, especially given that you're recuperating and that you have chosen to allow us to potentially slow down your recovery, but
it's fine.
hopefully you'll be
take a long time.
inspired and heal faster. We wish you a speedy recovery in any event. I wanted to go back to something you said at the very, very beginning, which was that you thought that this group, this wonderful group of people led by wonderful Joseph, is not representative of the Israeli and Palestinian body politic on the ground. And that may very well be true because of the increasing polarization within the communities, much less between the two peoples. Exactly. But I remember a time, and maybe I'm trying to bring back something that may be gone, but I hope and pray that it can be resurrected. And it is the land of resurrection, so we shouldn't lose hope. That when there was the beginning of the Oslo period, where it ceased to be Arab versus Israeli or Muslim Christian versus Jewish or Palestinians versus Israelis, it was indeed a period where it was those who were pro-peace and those who were not. And I felt I had more in common with a pro-peace Israeli than I did with the extremists or rejectionists.
You probably did. You probably did.
So how do we bring that back is my question.
All right. So there's two things I want to say. Yeah, I mean, the only way to do it would be to get a political horizon going, and I don't know how that's done. And I think anyone who claims they do know
IPC
is just, I mean, that right, obviously, but from, sort of implementable in the immediate moment, I don't know. Look, I have always felt that I had more in common with Israelis who were serious about ending the occupation and ending the conflict than I did with extremists on either side. So I understand that feeling. But Oslo was a bit of an illusion. And the reason I say that is that at least in terms of governments, maybe not in terms of the general public or individuals, but what became very clear at Camp David, I keep coming back to it, in the summer of 2000, Barack, Clinton, and Arafat, was that the parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians in particular, had been talking past each other. They'd been using the same words like state, for example, and meaning very different things. The Palestinians were taken aback to learn that for Israel, a non-contiguous Palestinian entity would be considered a state, that a Palestinian entity that did not control its airspace, its electromagnetic spectrum, or its borders would be considered a state. Things like that were really genuinely shocking to PLO negotiators who'd been dealing with these Israelis for a decade or more in reality. And I think there were also some points in which Israelis felt that they had been thinking one thing and Palestinians meaning something else. So the good feelings of the Oslo era were important, and we do have to get back to them. But I think they need to be a little bit more grounded next time in a shared, not just a shared language, because we had that, but at least at the government level, we lacked shared definitions. We didn't have shared definitions, and it was a very, very damaging fact that became, extremely counterproductive, to say the least.
Mr. Ibish, one more question, if you don't mind, from Sean.
Yeah, no, one more.
Sean.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Hussein. Just my question to you is, when you're mentioning about the Israeli movement and the security they want, that they told the Palestinians, sorry, we had to do it. We have no other alternative to keep our people safe.
I'm speculating, yes.
My question is, how's this Zionist movement thriving? This Zionist movement it's just basically a Jewish state for the Jewish people. you know, but with all this obstacle they're facing, like they're just trying to overcome the Supreme Court, where the government has full control and not the Supreme Court. And then some people are debating with that. And like, what's this definition that this is going through? Like Zionism, you know, you can't blend in democracy with Zionism. You know, it's just
All
like
right.
you cannot.
It's
You
an
know,
interesting question. Let me say, I think that I really look at this a little differently than most people, because I'm not that interested in Zionism as such. Okay, for me, the Zionist movement became a political anachronism in reality after 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel. And with every decade since then, the question of Zionism became more and more sort of an illusory one, a red herring for everyone who uses it, and less of a reality on the ground. And the reason I say that is that what you end up with, you know, between the first Zionist Congress in Babel and 1948, you know, the Zionist movement is a thing. It's a political project, transnational, to create a Jewish majority state or a Jewish-run state in mandatory Palestine, in all or part of mandatory Palestine. That's okay, or in the land of Palestine, or what have you. Okay, that makes sense. Once you have the Israeli state officially defining who is Jewish, and you know, and having people increasingly born into a Jewish Israeli citizenship and identity, the movement is less important. Like, as long as you have a majority of Jewish Israelis who are born in Israel, they are not Zionists in any meaningful sense, in the sense that they didn't self-select the way the earlier generations, especially from Europe, tended to do. They were born Jewish Israelis. They have a Jewish Israeli identity that they didn't pick, it just came to them. So what you're dealing with now is not a Zionist movement, but an Israeli state and Jewish Israeli nationalism, which finds its expression and its practical iteration through this Jewish Israeli state. But it's not a movement. It's a state with political factions within it. All right. Now, I understand what you're saying. You're talking about Zionism here as a proxy for Jewish supremacism inside Israel, and that's a big strand in Israeli politics. And the nation state law is, you know, certainly one of the most, in that sense, Zionistical, if you want to use that term, or Zionist, or what they would have said in the past, appropriate and Zionist response. You know, what they, but that's just branding, in my opinion. What it is a bunch of people who want, first of all, to protect Netanyahu from prison, who want, number two, to do unreasonable things, like bringing a tax felon to oversee taxes and things like that. And number three, the longest term vision, which is the most insidious, to get the courts out of the way so they cannot be an impediment to annexation in the future. These are the three agendas that are at work here. This is all internal politics within the Israeli state. It's not about Zionism as a movement. Now, you do see also people using Zionism as a rhetorical cudgel to beat each other up inside of Israel, right? I'm more Zionist than you. This is the Zionist thing to do, blah, blah, blah. And as a way of doing outreach to Jewish communities and other supporters, evangelicals and whatnot in the US, in the West, etc. And so that is done. But to me, the state, this is not about Zionism. This is about a state and society with people in it who are born in it, and that's the way it is. Some of them are more extreme than others. That doesn't make them more or less Zionist. It's not. So that's my answer to you. And now,
all right, let's go to closing remarks, and then I'll give you an opportunity to respond.
I have to say goodbye.
Okay, no problem.
All
A
right. Thank you
common
very much.
government is the only democratic government in the area and could bring peace, and peace is the only solution. Online elections are feasible and can be held securely. The country of Estonia, I have to correct my, I was under the impression that it's 9.5 million, but from what I had spoke with Anna, she said it's 1.5 million. So I'll correct that. I didn't correct it yet, but still, 1.5 million people holding election online is a good start. 1 day of war between Gaza and Israel is $100 million a day. $100 million a day could make this election a possibility. And we could, you know, we speak about the Israeli government and the Palestinian government, but there really are failed governments. They haven't been able to give the people of Israel and Palestine peace. And we speak about them as if their importance, and they are important, but as their importance is supreme. But we have to acknowledge that they failed to give us peace. They failed in the most important part, which is to give peace to the people of Israel and Palestine. And a common government will be able to give us peace, as we have demonstrated time and time again. And we see in the surveys that we take every time, and somewhere between 80 to 90 to 100% of you agree with that. $100 million could also buy you a Van Gogh, could buy you a Boeing or a mansion in Los Angeles. It's not a lot of money, and we could make this happen with very, very small investment. So I want to thank all of you for participating, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
all.
Thank
Thank you
you.
once again, everybody.